Okay, this is take two because my first video was 12 minutes long and that's not going to work. My name is Ruzbeh Shirazi. I'm at the University of Minnesota and I am faculty in the Comparative and International Development Education program here. And the question that I want to present for conversation is one that emerged from work that I've been doing here locally in two different high schools. And the question is, what does it mean to do social justice-oriented research in government schools when discourses of safety and security can work to not only regulate researcher access, but can also impose epistemic and methodological boundaries around what counts as meaningful research. So in the US, schooling is increasingly implicated in securitizing discourses, those that work to frame bodies as safe and secure, bodies that are suspect and threatening, and bodies in spaces that are in need of various forms of protection. Most prominently, we see that the language of safety and security has been mobilized in recent debates and legislative efforts in response to mass school shootings, or mass shootings at schools, notably the latest in Parkland, Florida. And a lot of these debates have centered on the arming and training of teachers, as well as increasing the numbers of police officers in schools who work as resource officers on the one hand, and on the other there have been greater mobilizations of protests around greater calling for increased gun control. However, in raising this issue of security and how it materializes in schools, we have to be mindful that there are multiple forms of security and safety at work in shaping educational meanings and practices and policies as well too. It's just that the physical safety aspects are the ones that are gaining all of the headlines currently right now. So of interest to me in particular are policies governing external research access to schools that also invoke notions of student safety, safe learning environments, and protecting instructional time, and how this language of safety and protection is also mobilized to govern what modes of inquiry in schools are possible and what research methods are acceptable in light of these safety and security concerns. So given how capacitating security is as a discourse and as a mode from which to articulate and authorize new policies within education, it raises many conceptual and methodological questions, I think, especially for anthropologists of education and youth studies, about how and to what extent we may work with and engage with our participants, and more broadly, which methodological approaches are viable and necessary in this kind of a climate under these conditions. Similarly, I think these conditions are also compelling us to grapple with the notions of, or how rather, notions of childhood and youth are being transformed in relation to the broader reconfiguration of schooling through discourses and practices of securitization. So one example briefly that I'll share here stems from my efforts to secure research access to a secondary school in a Midwestern American city to ethnographically examine immigrant and transnational experiences of schooling and how that contributes to membership and belonging. So while the project was carried out in 2013-2014 over the academic school year, the process of gaining research access actually took the entirety of the academic year before. So 2012-2013 was spent on securing permissions. So just very briefly to give you kind of an overview of what that process looked like, I established contact and started to build preliminary research relationships with teachers through volunteering at the school, attending public events, and just arranging several meetings with different teachers throughout the year in 2012. It was after some time of these meetings and kind of volunteering that I received approval from the teachers and the principal at the school to seek a formal partnership with the district that had to, with the school, to be approved by the district. So I think it's important to note here, I had received approval for the study through my university's institutional review board in order to carry out an ethnographic study within the school with the teachers and students that were of interest to me. And in order to gain district approval, I had to submit a long application detailing the nature of the research, what specifically I was aiming to learn, and how this research explicitly benefited the district. So prior to submitting the application, I also consulted the district's policies on research within schools, which seems supportive of external research partnerships. Now, once the application received the district, however, that several objections and challenges were voiced to the study that also started to invoke these different aspects of a securitizing discourse, so protection, safety, so on and so forth. So first, the topic was deemed as being too sensitive by the lead reviewer. As a result, I had to identify and solicit a district-level sponsor for the project, which itself took a long period of time to carry out. There were objections to the length of the study, seeing my presence within the classrooms as disruptive to learning. The reviewers initially said no to focus groups in order to protect student confidentiality. There were consent concerns that were raised and stipulations that I could only write about consented persons in the study, and I could not write about or take notes about non-consented persons. This again is a threshold that's far above the typical standard of benefits versus risks that we consider as researchers. There were revisions of consent forms to consent every single research method being used rather than a blanket consent form, which usually just refers to when a researcher wants to interview a student individually or in a group interview. And then in terms of data collection, this presented a quandary for me, a challenge in that as far as where I could observe and be present. I could be in the classroom, but I couldn't take notes in class until I had formal written consent from those who I was writing about, which pushed me towards asynchronous field notes and kind of carrying out waves of securing student consent. So what I'm trying to show here is how notions of safety and protection of learning are invoked by administrators to discipline and limit what kinds of research can be carried out in schools. In this instance, the regulatory aspects to ensure that my presence and project didn't constitute different forms of risk to the students meant that the questions and the research that motivated the study were not viable as research from the outset. And without their stipulations and corrections, my research proposal was incomplete or deficient or not really considered a viable proposal at all. So it was only through the enormous expenditures of time and advocacy that this project came to fruition, which indicates or suggests that it's only those with access to unfettered time and those who possess a requisite level of social capital who are going to be able to engage in inquiry and knowledge making. So I think we can start to see how such policies under such conditions begin to foreclose the possibility for deep engagements within classrooms, for foregrounding marginalized perspectives and voices, and ultimately for generating data that illustrates the limitations of existing conditions of schooling. I think that's a threat to us all. I'll stop there. Thanks.